This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Celebrated American playwright Tennessee Williams spent enough years living and writing in St. Louis that a festival dedicated wholly to him and his work will start its 8th iteration tomorrow, September 7th through September 14th. Tom Mitchell is Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana and serves as the St. Louis Tennessee Williams Festival Scholar. He joins us today to talk about his favorite writer's work, which he studied, directed, and adapted many times over, and to illuminate Williams' use of the concept of quote-unquote madness and its connections to the writer's own struggles with mental health. Tom, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
It's very good to be here.
So glad to have you. Now, let's talk first about the life of Tennessee Williams in St. Louis. He attended Soldan High School and University City High School. What was his childhood like here?
Well, he moved to the city with his family in 1918 when he was only 7 years old. The family moved around from through a couple of different apartments in the Central West End and then over into University City, so in the western part of the area. And the family was had difficulties. His parents fought with one another. His father had a drinking problem, and his sister eventually was known to have mental illness and was diagnosed with schizophrenia.
And so that obviously is not a great situation. Is that part of what informed the way that he felt about St. Louis?
I think so. There is the story that Williams really didn't like St. Louis, and I think part of that is true. It was a dirty, smoky city that was unlike the small town in Mississippi where he'd come from. But I think even more, it was the family tension that made him carry really bad memories of St. Louis. And actually, he had friends in St. Louis. He also describes good times in the city. So it wasn't all the difficulties of home life.
Mm-hmm. The festival is going to feature two performances two of Williams' plays, and that's Suddenly Last Summer and The Glass Menagerie. And both of these deal with mental health or quote-unquote madness, as people referred to it at this time. Tom, madness, and I'm saying quote-unquote because this is not a term that we use now, that also happens to be the subject of one of the panels that you were hosting at the festival. What is it that drew you to focus on this particular theme in Williams' work?
Well, it is in conjunction with the play Suddenly Last Summer and also Glass Menagerie in particular that mental illness, mental health are issues that seem particularly pertinent. Williams wrote Suddenly Last Summer in 1957, and he was going through psychoanalysis at the time and dealing with those family difficulties that had shaped his life growing up. His sister by that time had been diagnosed and was actually institutionalized. So he was also dealing with that part of the experience of mental illness in his family. It affected the way that he wrote Suddenly Last Summer, and it is very central to the story in that play. And I think it's important for us to be able to sort of take a look at what was he thinking and how do we understand that now. Mm-hmm. So, it seems particularly pertinent.
Especially right now, given all of the concern and the attention to mental health, so much more so than I remember in many years past. Now, we are talking about work that was produced from the 1930s to the 1950s. What did mental health care mean for Williams? And what was the role that quote-unquote madness played in his plays?
Well, in particular, it's connected to his sister, Rose and her life. And when she was in her late teen years, she started to exhibit behaviors that were concerning. Her mother took her to see doctors who were connected to Washington University and at Barnes Hospital. And as they worked with her and got to know more about her situation, it eventually became clear that the problem was not that was more serious than what they might have thought. So Williams, as her brother, he was very close to his sister. He was only a year younger than she was very clearly observing her experience and feeling that too. He also had a probably what we would call a severe anxiety attack in the mid 1930s, and that led him to leave the job that he was working at the International Shoe Company, and leave town for several months to sort of pull himself together. And it was after that breakdown that he came back to St. Louis and really began his career writing plays as well as poetry and stories.
And while he was in St. Louis, and then elsewhere too, I mean, do we know whether Williams sought mental health care for himself?
Yeah, in the 1950s, he underwent psychoanalysis with a doctor in New York who did talk therapy with him a lot, really bringing up the family conflicts he'd had, but also then prescribing a variety of medications. And Williams eventually had some serious problems with dependence on those medications as well as abuse of alcohol. That led later in his life, in the 60s, to coming back to St. Louis to sort of an intervention by his brother to help him get off of the drugs and alcohol.
Mm-hmm. And specifically, it was a Barnes Hospital here.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, there's another element here I think that we shouldn't miss, and that is that Williams was a gay man, and his plays featured gay characters, including Sebastian in Suddenly Last Summer. And a lot of people at the time Williams wrote and lived, and today even, many people saw queerness as a kind of mental illness. Was Williams' queerness part of the quote, madness that's featured in Tennessee's plays? And, how do you approach that as a scholar?
Mm-hmm. No, I actually, I don't think Williams ever would have considered his sexual orientation as a psychological disease or that. I think he recognized that it was socially a difficulty, but I think he was relatively comfortable as a gay man by the time that he came out, which wasn't until 1939, after he'd left St. Louis. And in Suddenly Last Summer, he's really dealing with, especially there is a mother character that's something like William's own mother, she's dealing with her son, Sebastian, the poet that you mentioned, who was gay. And if there is any mental illness, it seems to be her denial of facing up to Sebastian's orientation and his sexuality, and that sort of irrational denial that she carries with her.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tom, you are the editor of a new collection of Williams' early short stories. It was released just this past spring in April under the title Caterpillar Dogs and Other Early Stories. How is it that you uncovered these works?
Well, I've been interested in Williams' early career for quite a few years, and I'm a theater director. Primarily, I am retired from teaching theater at the University of Illinois. And I had the good fortune of being able to direct the 5 or 6 of Williams' early plays that have not really been done much until we uncovered them again. But it led me also to looking into the collections of Williams' material that is at different libraries around the country. And I was very surprised to see so many short stories that he wrote that have not been published. When he was a young man in St. Louis, in particular in the 30s, he wrote quite a lot of stories and would submit them to literary magazines and popular magazines, hoping to get them published and to make some money and to make a name for himself. But eventually, when his career turned to playwriting and he started to have success as a playwright, many of those short stories were just sort of tucked away, and he parked them in these collections in different university libraries and so forth, but for the most part didn't come back to trying to publish the early things he'd written.
Mm-hmm.
So I find that there's a great deal to be enjoyed and discovered in looking at the early stories. They tell us a lot about Williams. They tell a lot about what St. Louis was like in the years in which he lived, especially in the late mid to late 1930s. And it makes you think differently about things.
Yeah. We'd love to get a sense of the way Tennessee Williams saw St. Louis. Could you share an excerpt from one of the short stories you discovered, perhaps
Sure.
Stair to the Roof?
Yes, yeah. This is a story about a young clerk who's working in the International Shoe Company, which folks might recognize as now the City Museum downtown and the Last Hotel. So it was in that building downtown where Williams actually did work. And Williams himself would take breaks up to the roof of that building. And in this story, he describes the young man looking out. And this is how he describes it. He loved to look out over the eastern horizon, with its hazy intimation of lands stretching beyond the river and the city, and perhaps continuing in beautiful, clean undulations until it reached the ocean. In the summer, you could see upon the opposite bluffs of the river a sort of golden smoke and greenish flame, which reason rather than vision told you were fields of various grains and corn. There was also a white thread winding among the glittering undulations, which could be rationally explained as a highway that carried adventurous spirits into the north and the south. Then there was the river itself, which seemed to laugh at the static city and the static humanity which it fostered. I love that description. I've gone up to the roof of that building, and you really do see that sort of a vista even today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for reading that, Tom. Static city and static humanity compared to phrases like hazy intimation and adventurous spirits. I mean, there's not much affection there. And you talked earlier about how Tennessee Williams felt about St. Louis and some of the reasons why. Did he ever change the way that he, talked about St. Louis and what his relationship to it was?
Well, he was a writer, and so he wrote about the city colorfully. I think it was the conflict that he had with the city that sort of led him to the best of his writing. Of course, Glass Menagerie is that memorable story that is set here. But he never had a sentimental feeling, a sentimentally warm feeling about St. Louis, but he certainly took a great deal of his experience from the city along with him throughout his career.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tom, you've directed some of Tennessee Williams' better-known plays and adapted his short stories for the stage. And that means you're very much more than a casual fan. Now, what do you see in Williams' early short stories that also stands out in the plays that, years later made him famous and beloved?
Mm-hmm. I think, in particular, in his stories, you get the inner life of characters in the same way that you do in plays. Plays, of course, embody those lives, and a story you read and imagine it in your own mind. But he does a wonderful job of sort of getting you in the minds of characters, and then in the short stories, really isolating singular events that are dramatic in the lives of these different characters. And in this collection of Caterpillar Dogs, there are 7 different stories that each capture different little vignettes in the lives of a wide range of different characters.
Tom, thanks so much for joining us today and telling us about William's work and his life.
Thanks, it's been good to be with you.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.